Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon Chapters 23 and 24. It was rather odd, Inasa reflected, to be sitting in UA's assembly hall in his shiketsu uniform. The hall was almost full, which was giving him a real understanding of how many hero schools were in Japan. From what he'd been told, UA's principal, Nezu, has requested all hero schools to nominate 3 people to attend a special training program. Some schools had gracefully declined, but many had sent their students, and 1 teacher. He had no idea what they were going to be taught or trained in, but Kenshin Naruhado, Shiketsu's principal, had indicated that they would be taught by all the hero teachers present, including All Might, and that it was an opportunity that couldn't be overlooked. Shiketsu's principal wasn't here, instead he'd sent Koi Sasum to accompany them. Shiketsu had sent him, Taiki Okazaki and Amy Mizumo to be their representatives. "Welcome to UA," Nezu was saying. It appeared as if the rat was smiling, but Inasa wasn't sure. He definitely looked intent. "I know many of you are wondering about our actions. We have brought students together from around the country to teach you how to work together." Inasa heard that, but didn't believe it. He doubted anyone really believed it, but they'd all act like they did. "Villains are changing the way they work," Principal Nezu continued. "And heroes need to adapt. Every school teaches the importance of teamwork, but there is still competition and sometimes miscommunication between heroes. We've brought you together to learn to work together, to ignore the artificial boundaries of educational institutions. For this, the first time, we've encouraged each school to send who they want. As this program continues, we will ensure that all year levels have the opportunity to participate." Inasa nodded slightly at the explanation. It sounded good, but were villains really changing the way they work that much? Or was it more that a particular set of villains were now active? He didn't say anything, but he would be alert for the answer. The last few weeks. Anyone looking at the history of heroes would be able to spend months just looking at the events that had happened and the implications they had for society. It was bad enough that All Might had been revealed, but the number 1 hero was still there, but so was the knowledge that a villain who could fight him existed. If it had just been that, All Might revealed defeating that villain, then the world would have gone back to the way it was. The incident would be important, but not the keystone event that it was. It was what came after that was causing the most distress. And Inasa still wasn't sure what he thought, that it was Izuku at the center of it all. His quirk. His real quirk, the ability to take and use other people's quirks, was mind-blowing. When Daiki Yayozoru had appeared on national television, begging Izuku to give his daughter's quirk back, the world had known and had reacted. Most wanted Izuku to give the quirks he'd taken back, but then they wanted him executed and his body incinerated. They didn't want any trace of him to exist. They didn't want him to have children. They didn't want any knowledge of him to exist. There was a fair proportion of the world who wanted to pretend he never existed. Others were more reasonable. They wanted Izuku to give the quirks back and then to be punished, but Inasa didn't know. Daiki Yayozoru was correct in some ways. All Izuku had done was use his quirk. That wasn't that unusual. It was just that his quirk was far more dangerous than others, and Inasa didn't know what to think, and so he'd been avoiding thinking about it. "Tomorrow, we will begin testing to determine your level of skill and to assign the most appropriate teachers," Nezu was saying, "but for today, we want you to get to know each other. In the future, you will all be colleagues, so use this opportunity to get to know each other in an informal setting." The rat nodded in an encouraging way and stepped down from the lectern. No one else got up, and Inasa realized that they truly did expect the students here to mingle. He looked around and noticed Koi nodding at them encouragingly. Inasa was wondering who he should talk to. He didn't know anyone here, and thankfully no one else seemed sure either when a shout caught their attention. "What the fuck is that traitor doing here?" Outrage laced the tone, and Inasa wasn't the only one who turned to stare. The shout had come from a blonde teen in a UA uniform. He was snarling at another teen, who was also in a UA uniform. Inasa recognized them both. He didn't need Principal Naruhado going over notable people who would be participating in the program to recognize one of them. Shoto Todoroki, Endeavor's youngest son. The blonde was Katsuki Bakugo, a UA first year, who had come first in the regular entrance exam and first at the sports festival, and who had then been kidnapped by the League of Villains and had his quirk stolen by Izuku. The confusion Inasa felt about that was quickly forgotten as he watched the drama. Katsuki was pointing at Shoto, but it was obvious he wanted to do something more. From what Anasa had seen, the blonde's quirk allowed him to produce explosions from his hands. That would explain why his fingers were curled into claws, and there was something in his posture which screamed his aggression. "Oh, come on," someone said. Anasa wasn't sure who. "At least he's not one of them," they continued, and while Anasa couldn't see what the speaker was pointing at, there was definitely the sense that they were. "Shuza," someone objected, and a path cleared so that Anasa could see. Shuza turned out to be. Actually, Anasa wasn't sure if they were male or female since they were fairly androgynous. They had brown hair, cut. You couldn't use haircut to tell gender, and it really didn't matter. He didn't recognize the school's uniform, and what Anasa could tell immediately was that they had the classic human body and were pointing at someone with a mutant-type quirk. It took him a moment for Anasa to realize what Shuza was saying. "What?" he whispered in shock. He wasn't the only one who couldn't believe what they were hearing. "You want to go for it?" The person Shuza was pointing at growled. From the corner of his eye, Anasa saw several people write something on clipboards they were holding. He remembered Nezu's words. "Tomorrow, we will begin testing to determine your level of skill and to assign the most appropriate teachers," and Anasa had no doubt that is what they would be doing tomorrow. However, that didn't say they wouldn't be tested today as they mingled. He had a feeling that Shuza had just failed. "Who cares about that?" Bakugo yelled, rolling his eyes at Shuza. Anasa got the impression that no matter what other faults Bakugo had, and it seemed he had many, mutant discrimination was not one of them. "I want to know why the fuck that traitor is here," he yelled again. That brought everyone's attention back to Shoto. Even those with the clipboards. The teen looked at Bakugo, and Anasa realized he didn't know what to say. It was an odd situation. Shoto, like Bakugo, had had his quirk stolen, but unlike Bakugo, Shoto had gotten his back. "I was invited," Shoto told him. "You traitor!" Bakugo yelled and lunged forward. Another UA student with bright red hair grabbed him and actually pulled him back. "You can't, man," the red-haired student said. Anasa recognized him as Kirishima. Shiketsu had gone over the names and quirks of all the students who had had theirs stolen. Kirishima's was hardening. It was a physical but useful quirk. It appeared as if Kirishima was still strong, even without his quirk. He managed to pull Bakugo back. "You know that's not the case," Kirishima said. They all knew it wasn't the case. It was one of the reasons the last few weeks had been such a rollercoaster. The media had been all over the fact that quirks could be stolen, and then, when Shoto had his back, they'd gone insane again. There had been accusations that he'd sold them out to the villain, but Endeavor had made sure that there was more than one person with truth detection quirks involved in interrogating his son. Endeavor didn't have a good relationship with the media. But he'd also made sure that there were multiple reporters present at the interrogations. They'd reported what the people with lie detectors had sensed. Shoto had been contacted by someone, and he didn't know who, about getting his quirk back. He had thought it was a scam and had gone along with it, and then he had met Izuku and gotten his quirk back. The interviews had admitted there was a payment involved, but they were also clear that Shoto hadn't paid it, and neither had Endeavor. They were clear, insofar as they could, that the payment had been made by someone unknown. No one had ever said what the payment was though, but Anasa figured the authorities knew. Anasa looked at Shoto. He hadn't changed much since the recommendation entrance exam. He hadn't changed much either. Not physically at least. But he'd like to think he had changed as a person. Watching Shoto now was like watching Shoto at the recommendation exam. It was. Shoto's physical reactions were much the same, but Anasa realized he felt different. If there was one thing learning that Izuku was the son of a villain, and was a villain himself, had taught him, was that things were not always what they seemed. With that knowledge now influencing him, he could look at Endeavor's son's reactions and responses differently. The other teen was cold. That was true. He was aloof. That was also true. Shoto was awkward and didn't have many friends. That was probably true. Anasa couldn't be certain, but from what he'd seen today and what he'd seen earlier, he thought it was true. And it was. He didn't know what to feel about that. Heroes were meant to be hot-blooded, but implied in that was that they were approachable and good. If Anasa put Shoto and Izuku together, then it was Izuku who was approachable, and warm and friendly, and Shoto who was. Anasa mentally shook his head firmly. There was a lot going on with the situation in general that he didn't understand and that he probably wouldn't understand. There were things that could not be said. He knew that. Every hero student knew that, and the point for now was that it seemed as if Shoto was a naturally cold individual and his reaction at the recommendation exam wasn't necessarily unfriendly but was how he'd been trained. Everyone knew Endeavor wasn't All Might. They knew he was more focused on clearing missions, and he came across as far more cold and brisk. It had been highlighted by Shiketsu in a lesson on heroic style. So, for now, he'd give Shoto another chance. And maybe. Anasa didn't know. As much as he might want to believe Shoto had betrayed them, there'd been too much evidence to the contrary. He kind of hoped they could try again, but that was a question for a different time. He shouldn't be here, Bakugo spat, but he appeared to be calming down. Anasa wasn't sure what to say, and he got the impression that most of the people here didn't know what to say either. He was kind of curious to know why Bakugo and Kirishima were here. This was hero training and they didn't have their quirks. Were they continuing because they thought they could get them back? He shook his head, and then he realized he'd actually been just as bad as Shuzo in his own way. The two boys were obviously fit and capable. They could be heroes if they got the right support. After all, the actions of a hero should be something from the heart, not just something you could do. If they had the right mindset and the right support, then they could be heroes. Maybe they'd never be number one, but they could be heroes. He looked over to Koi. Her eyes were narrowed, but that was all he could read of her expression. She then saw him watching and gave him a smile. Go on, she encouraged. Ma'am? Go on. Mingle, she encouraged. This is a good opportunity to meet some of your future co-workers, she added, looking at Taiki and Amy too. Yes ma'am. They all agreed, though Anasa could tell that like him. They didn't really know what to do. He heaved an internal sigh and deliberately stepped away from Koi, and made his way towards a group who were looking around. There were actually two groups together, and he recognized the uniforms of Saya and Ketsubutsu. Saya was an all-girls hero training school, and Ketsubutsu Academy was one of the schools Shiketsu unofficially allied with during the provisional hero licensing exam every year against UA. Most people thought Shiketsu's uniform was overdone, especially with their insistence that they wear their hats, but Anasa thought that Saya and Ketsubutsu showed the real extremes. Saya's uniform was formal, while Ketsubutsu's was the definition of informal, being little more than a gray polo shirt and brown trousers. Sure, they wore a blazer and tie at times, but Ketsubutsu's uniform was very casual. By contrast, Saya's was complex, consisting of a black undershirt, over which the students wore a double-breasted, high-necked jacket with a large bow. They wore boots over very tight-fitting trousers and topped it off with a beret. Shiketsu's uniform lay somewhere between the two schools in terms of formality, but was closer to Saya's. He wore a blue shirt with 2 rows of buttons, trimmed in orange, and of course Shiketsu's hat. Shiketsu, one of the students, greeted him as the teacher wandered away. All the teachers were probably going to grade their performance mingling, or do their own mingling. Anasa thought as he saw Ketsubutsu's teacher look around and make a beeline towards one of UA's teachers. It was Eraserhead if he wasn't mistaken. The underground hero had shot to fame with the events happening to his class, and while none of the Shiketsu teachers had said anything about it directly, Koi had been amused, muttering about how much Aizawa hated media attention. Saya and Ketsubutsu, Anasa returned the greeting, nodding to both groups. There was silence for a few moments before the tall girl from Saya chuckled. She had light blue, almost white hair, cut short around her face but left long at the back. This is quite the gathering, she said, gesturing around. It is, one of the Ketsubutsu students agreed. I wonder if it will be the event that topples UA? They murmured, loud enough to be heard, but quietly enough that they could always pretend they didn't mean anyone to hear it. The Saya student looked thoughtful for a moment. Or the event that lets them remain ascendant, she replied. I'm Psycho Intelli, she said, holding out one gloved hand. Anasa Yoarashi, he took her hand. She was obviously the leader of the Saya group. Taratsusa Hana, one of the other Saya students said, followed by Shomi Henshi. Anasa shook each of their hands briefly before turning to the Ketsubutsu students. Their lead appeared to be a female student with bright green eyes and red hair. She grinned at them, and Anasa saw that all 3 of the Ketsubutsu student shirts had third-year markings on them. Ishina Fushigi, she introduced herself, before gesturing at the others. Itajiro Toteki, a guy with pale skin and jet black hair, said. Shikui Makabe, the other guy said. He was blue all over with no nose, and when Anasa shook his hand, he realized it wasn't just blue skin, it was some sort of armor. It was tough, and he could see the joins in Shikui's neck which allowed him to move. He wondered what Shikui had thought of Shusa's display earlier. It appeared as if Shikui picked up on that, and he rolled his eyes. Some students are stupid, he announced, glancing to where Shusa was attempting to make themselves known to the UA students. They were ignoring the attempt for the most part. In any other situation, Anasa would have been offended. That's almost what Shoto had done to him, but now, he gave an understanding grin to Shikui, and while the other student's face couldn't move to show his agreement. Anasa got that impression. So what do you think of this? Taratsusa asked into the slightly awkward silence that settled after the introductions. Anasa was impressed that she hadn't asked about quirks. That was what almost everyone did, especially to a hero student. You don't want to know about our quirks? Itajiro asked. Taratsusa shook her head. We'll find out about them in due course, she explained. Saiko seemed a little disappointed but held her tongue, and to Inasa's amusement. Itajiro didn't seem to quite know how to handle that. There's a lot that's not being said, Ishina told Taratsusa, and got a nod at that statement. Even so. Shomi shook her head. It's hard. She didn't finish. It's hard to believe someone has a quirk that can take quirks, Saiko finished, gesturing vaguely towards the UA students. They have been medically diagnosed as quirkless now, Ishina told them. I saw the reports. How did you get them? Saiko demanded gently. Internship, Ishina explained. Saiko nodded. There's no chance they'll come back? Ishina shook her head. They don't have the toe joint, it's not like that grew in, but they now have only a dormant quirk factor, and without that, they can't manifest their quirk. They could get them back, I suppose, if Izuku gave them back, and that's what happened with Shoto, she said. His quirk factor is active again. Where do you intern to know that? Saiko asked before he could. One of the very few HPSC-approved quirk research facilities, Ishina told them with a smile, as if she'd heard and answered that question before. Are you sure you should be telling us this? Shomi prompted. Ishina shrugged. Endeavor wanted everything suppressed, except for how Shoto got his quirk back, but Shoto said all the knowledge should be shared, so I know it, and… She shrugged to indicate there was no restriction. Anasa nodded. With everything else that was hidden with Shoto's case, releasing what information he could made sense, and for someone who was as cold as Shoto seemed, it was a difficult decision. Reluctantly, Anasa felt his esteem for Endeavor's son rise. He'd still been a dick at the recommendation exam, but maybe there was a reason, and Anasa looked around, watching as students from many schools spoke to each other. Nothing was ever as it seemed. He had to remember that, so for now, he'd give Shoto another chance. When Izuku awoke, he could hear the muffled sounds of talking. He dressed and wandered to the bar's kitchen. Kurogiri had declared that he was not going to take care of them, except he kind of did. The Misty Man usually left out a stack of bowls and a packet of cereal for them. It was an easy breakfast, especially if you grabbed a piece of fruit from the bowl that was mysteriously never empty. When Izuku arrived in the kitchen, he saw Yakuni happily chatting with Dabi and Mr. Compress. Twice wasn't present, Whisper was probably still asleep, and Himiko was still with Dr. Kyudai. He poured himself some cereal, and grabbed the milk as he sat down, blinking as he listened to the conversation. He had to talk to Yakuni today about a lot of things, but having the young man talk to the others was a good way to establish him, and Yakuni could back up many of the things Izuku had said to them. Izuku blinked as he looked down at the cereal. Something was wrong with it. Yakuni sniggered. Up too late? He teased. Izuku realized what the issue was and actually poured some milk into the bowl. Just a little bit, he said, before he yawned. When he'd woken up, he had the oddest feeling that he'd dreamed, but he couldn't remember what his dreams were, so had dismissed it. Did you get them back to the lab okay? He asked. Yakuni nodded, and then took a sip of coffee. What do you want me to do with them? The question kind of took him by surprise, and Izuku was aware of the way Dabi and Mr. Compress were watching him. They were interested in the answer. He was interested in the answer. He'd never really had the power of life and death of others. Well, not those who he felt nothing for. Tomura, Shuyona, and those who had attacked Ochako were exceptions. There was strong emotion there. There had been emotion yesterday when Himiko was attacked, but that had faded. He'd taken Overhaul's quirk and he'd taken the rest of Overhaul's facilities and people. He'd won, and with Yakuni here, he was sure they could heal Himiko, one way or another, so the emotion had faded. And that reminded him. He needed to find out what the heroes had done with the vigilante who'd attacked Ochako. You wanted to see if you could make one of them into a high-end? Azuku asked to buy himself some time to think. Yakuni nodded. I think Rapper could be one, he said with a shrug. The others? Azuku prompted. The young man thought about it for a moment. Maybe Rikia, he said slowly. But the others would be just normal nomas, he concluded. So you can make him yourself? Dabi asked curiously. Yakuni shook his head, taking another sip of coffee. I can do some of it, but I need the doctor's help on other bits. Azuku gave him a sharp look. Learn, he instructed. And if the doctor gives you another mission, check with me first, he added. The other man gave him a grin. I work for you, Yakuni confirmed. You do. And I have a whole heap of quirks for you. He continued. You do? Yeah, but I don't know where they are. I believe Gigantomachia has them, Kurogiri interrupted. He knew, from the doctor, that his father had sent Gigantomachia away so the quirks were safe. Yakuni also seemed relieved. That's good, he murmured. So, what do you want me to do with them? Yakuni asked again. They had to do something with them, and Azuku was coming to realize that he couldn't be the one with all the quirks. Physically he could, but he couldn't do everything. He'd need to rest, and he needed to be able to trust others to do at least part of the work for him. Changing everything relied on more than him. He could direct the change, but others would have to make it happen. What quirks do they have? He asked. You took Overhaul's, right? Yakuni said. He nodded. That one allows you to... Yakuni shuddered. He used it on you? Azuku asked softly. He nodded. It allows you to disassemble and reassemble things and people. Azuku blinked. Can you use it to heal someone? He asked. Maybe, Yakuni admitted. I'm not sure. I know you can put them back together, not quite right, but... He shrugged. Experiment? Maybe, Azuku agreed. I took 2 others then, he added. Mimicry and chronostasis, Yakuni told him. Mimicry lets you transfer your body and mind into solid objects and then control them as if they are your body. And chronostasis slows people down, but you have to hit them with your hair, Yakuni explained. Azuku nodded. It sounded interesting, and mimicry might be a good way of escaping, but chronostasis was a quirk he could give to someone else. I got an energy one off someone last night, he said. Rikia's, Yakuni said. Will you be able to make him into a Nomu still? Shouldn't be an issue, Yakuni said. And it won't matter if it is, he added with a shrug. You'll just put another quirk into him? Mr. Compress asked. Yep. Yakuni agreed before he frowned slightly. Actually, you might be interested in Shin's quirk. He mused. Which one was that? The one who wouldn't shut up. His quirk is confession. Overhaul trusted the 2 who were with him the most, but he liked to use Shin's quirk a lot. If Shin asked you a question, he could force you to tell the truth. That was a useful quirk, and while Azuku would like to have it, he could see the advantage of having someone else using it on his behalf. Except who? That was a question for later. Make a copy? Azuku suggested. Yakuni grinned at him. I have samples from them all, so I can make you copies of everyone's quirk. He nodded, and then Azuku realized he couldn't stall any longer. This was the type of decision he was going to have to make. This was the type of decision his father had made every day, and the type of decision he would have to get used to making. He held their lives in his hand. His decision was life and death for them. Azuku felt faintly sick with the knowledge. There's no chance any of them would follow me. Is there? He murmured the question, already knowing the answer. You could check with Shin's quirk, Yakuni replied, but he sounded doubtful. Azuku shook his head. There's no need, he said more firmly. He couldn't show weakness here. And there was another consideration, Azuku realized suddenly. He had said he wanted to rescue his father, and his father was in Tartarus. It was very unlikely that he'd be able to simply walk in there and get his father out. He was most likely going to have to assault the place. That was going to require manpower. Most villains would not assault Tartarus, no matter how much he paid them. Nomu had no choice. If he wanted to get his father out, then he would need all the help he could get, even if it was the menial help of a lesser Nomu. Make 'em all into Nomu, Izuku said firmly. From the corner of his eye, he saw Dabi and Mr. Compress nod and he knew he'd made the right decision by them. I don't have a need for them, so just put them into storage, and there's a couple of things I want you to focus on first. Izuku continued. Yakuni cocked his head slightly. Quirk copies, he explained. That I can do. What ones do you want? Yakuni chirped. That shape-changing quirk you made for Dad. I want another one. I want regeneration as well, and this one, Izuku added, reaching into his quirk pocket to pull out the genetic sample he'd gotten from Hitoshi, before he held it out to Yakuni. He was going to practice with Overhaul's and Eri's quirks, but if killing Tomura had shown him one thing, then it was best to have backup plans. He could potentially use Overhaul's quirk to heal his father, but he got the impression that the Yakuza's quirk was kind of complicated. Eri's quirk also had potential, for his dad, for Himiko and for Ochako. But if what he recalled Yakuni telling him last night was true, then he'd have to figure out what type of energy it needed. Either way though, he would practice with it and yesterday had been a surprisingly fruitful day. Except for Himiko. Oh, the young man said, taking the vial. What's this one? He asked. A friend's quirk, Izuku admitted. He looked to Mr. Compress and Dabi. Do you guys want an extra quirk? He asked, half-teasingly. It was kind of funny to see their expressions. Atsuhiro looked shocked. Dabi actually looked like he was contemplating it. Didn't you say having 2 quirks is dangerous? The fire villain asked eventually. Most people can handle having 2, Yakuni answered for him. Some go insane, but most can handle 2. It's when they get to 3 or 4 that they break, he replied happily. Tempting, Dabi murmured. But? Izuku prompted. I don't think so, Dabi concluded. He chuckled. It was what he had expected, but Izuku had another idea. Actually, he said slowly, thinking about it. As a bit of a fun exercise, why don't we think of something to deal with the number 2 hero? Izuku asked. He saw the way Dabi's eyes widened and Atsuhiro's surprise. Why not All Might? He asked. Izuku shook his head. Because he won't be number 1 for much longer. You saw his injuries, and his true form? He asked unnecessarily. The whole world had. That's tied to a time limit. He's going to have to retire soon, Izuku explained. And once he does... Well, I still want to kill him, he admitted, but I think it would be better to take care of it quietly. If we attack a powerless man, then... He didn't have to tell him what the impression would be. Atsuhiro nodded slowly as he worked through the implications. The brief explanation had given Dabi time to recover from his surprise. So what do you mean by deal with Endeavor? Dabi asked. I mean deal with, Izuku replied. If you could have the perfect quirk, or combination of quirks to fight him and win, what would they be? That brought understanding to their faces. Dabi actually grinned. A minor strength quirk, and an absolute fire and heat-proofing quirk would do it, the fire-quirked villain suggested. You might need something more, Atsuhiro said as he considered the problem. What do you mean? Dabi demanded. Izuku could see what the magician meant but let Atsuhiro explain. He assumed that's why Kurogiri and Yakuni were also keeping quiet. After telling him that Gigantomachia had the quirks Yakuni had collected for him, Kurogiri had sat at the table with a pot of tea and just listened. Those 2 quirks would be enough to overwhelm Endeavor, Atsuhiro agreed, so long as the person was willing to use them, but Endeavor is seldom alone, he pointed out. You'd need something to deal with the sidekicks. Or maybe have some way of taking him by surprise. Dabi nodded as he considered that. The first high-end could probably do it, Yakuni murmured. What do you mean? Izuku asked. The first high-end Nomu could defeat Endeavor, he repeated. It doesn't have fireproofing, but it's got flight, strength, regeneration and pocket, so it can store other Nomu. Dabi chuckled. And they deal with the sidekicks or create other diversions, he said. Yakuni nodded. How good is regeneration? Dabi asked. It's pretty good, Izuku replied. You've got it? The fire villain picked up on the implications. He nodded but didn't offer a demonstration. I got it after I got the scar, Izuku said, referring to the faint scar on his face. Dabi nodded. Could we shove fireproofing into the first high-end? Izuku mused. To make certain. I don't think Dorama would let you, Yakuni said. Izuku just gave him a look. It reminded Yakuni who was in charge. I'm not sure the high-end could take it. The young man clarified. That was a different matter. Why not? Izuku asked. From what I understand, the high-ends are on the very limit of what a human can take. And they are outliers. Most people can handle 2 quirks without going insane, but say a quarter can handle 3 quirks, then a quarter of those can handle 4 and so on. By the time you get to 6 quirks, that's 0.4% of the population, Yakuni explained. I don't know exactly what the ratios are, and what I've just said is generous. So, there aren't that many people who can become high-ends and, with the ratios, you don't want to risk adding another quirk. Izuku frowned as he thought about Yakuni's explanation. It made sense, except Gigantomachia had more quirks than that, and he wasn't a high-end. Gigantomachia is a special case, Kurogiri said before he could ask. Izuku nodded at that, and didn't ask for any further explanation. He didn't want to give away Gigantomachia's secrets. All right, Yakuni said, as he downed the last of his coffee and plonked the cup onto the table. I'd better get to work on those quirks, he said, nodding to Izuku. And the Nomu, he added. After you clean up, Kurogiri interjected. Yakuni looked at him. Your breakfast dishes, the Misty Man said blandly. The young man nodded and picked them up and took them to the sink to wash up. Izuku looked down at his now empty bowl of cereal and decided that he wanted a little bit more for breakfast. He looked over at the bowl of fruit and picked out an apple. The fruit rose up and floated over to him. Show off, Yakuni muttered. Izuku yawned again. Yeah, he agreed. Actually, why don't you practice on that? Yakuni asked. Practice what? Atsuhiro asked. Overhaul or Aries quirk, he explained. Oh. Izuku said. Overhaul's to disassemble it and Aries to fix it. Yakuni nodded. It won't matter if you muck up. I will return after the experiment, Kurogiri said, quickly standing and taking his teacup and the small pot with him. Dabi snorted his laughter. What's with him? For a moment Izuku didn't know what was wrong, but then he remembered the one and only time he'd used a quirk around food with Kurogiri present. Izuku didn't really remember it personally, he'd been 5 at the time, but Kurogiri had shown him the pictures often enough. He'd lost control of Kaylee Imperium while blowing out the birthday candles on his cake. It had meant the cake had sort of exploded. And it had gone everywhere. There had even been cake on the ceiling. He doesn't like me experimenting with quirks on food, Izuku gave the explanation. Implied in Kurogiri's statement was that he'd return, and the kitchen had best be set to rights if anything happened. Izuku looked at the apple. It was one apple. Even if something went wrong, how much mess could it make? Give it a try, Yakuni encouraged. Maybe try and slice the apple first? He suggested. Izuku nodded and concentrated on that. He could slice the apple with Kaylee Imperium, but he wanted to use the Yakuza's quirk. He pulled it up, remembering the feel of it from yesterday when he'd taken it. Overhaul's quirk was one of those which was relatively small, but it felt kind of spiky to his mind. It almost felt like it didn't want to obey him. He grabbed it and focused on the apple. For a moment nothing happened, and then it seemed to shimmer, as if it was behind a heat haze. Then it fell into 4 neat quarters. Just as he'd envisaged. Izuku grinned, but then the apple disintegrated. It wasn't like Tomura's quirk. It didn't go to dust, but Izuku was left staring at a pile of pulp. A small puddle of liquid spread out from it. He was eloquent in his description. Not what you intended? Atsuhiro asked pointedly. The magician already knew the answer. This is why we practice, Yakuni said, waving one hand dismissively. Try Eri's quirk to fix it, he advised. Izuku nodded slowly, and let go of Overhaul's quirk as he pulled the girl's one to him. This one was... It didn't feel spiky or like anything much. It just felt like any of his quirks. He looked pointedly at the apple pulp, and willed it to return to being a whole apple. As with Overhaul's quirk, there was a moment when it didn't appear to have worked. Then, it was almost like he'd created a little miniature tornado in the apple pulp. The fruit bits picked themselves up, and swirled around each other, the same with the liquid, and they formed into an apple. Izuku pulled back on the quirk, but it continued. As he watched, the apple lost its luster and shrank back into nothing. A flower appeared but quickly disappeared, and by the time the feeling of the quirk being active vanished, there was only a tiny amount of dust there. What? Dabi demanded. Yakuni sighed. That's what happens when the quirk doesn't stop in time, he observed. We are back to pollen, he added, brushing the dust off the table. Izuku noted it was slightly yellow. I stopped it, he said. Stopped what? Atsuhiro asked. I stopped the quirk, Izuku explained. It just didn't stop, he added. I think that was her problem as well, Yakuni said, before he fixed his eyes on Izuku. Did you want to try again? He asked. No, Izuku said slowly. I'll try again after I get a feel for the quirk, he added. That makes a difference? Dabi asked curiously. It can, Izuku said with a small nod. I definitely stopped the quirk and it kept going, so either it just goes until it's out of energy or there's a minimum time for it. Or, he shrugged. Or I don't know how to use it properly yet. I'll keep practicing through, Izuku reassured those who had been watching. He was definitely going to practice Eri's quirk. If he could make it work the way it seemed to work then. He could heal Ochako. He could heal Himiko. He could heal his dad. More than heal his dad actually. He could return his father to the prime of his life. That would be so much better than having his father take over Tomura's body. Izuku gave them a smile. He was still upset that Himiko had lost her quirk. He was upset that the Yakuza had raised their gun against him. He was upset with himself that he'd turned his back on them. He wouldn't repeat that mistake. But there was hope. And if his dad already had a copy of Himiko's quirk and Yakuni could make another copy then. She'd be quirkless for a little bit, but that was all. And that was a victory. End. The Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon, Chapters 23 and 24. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Join me for the next chapters. Or check out my other works.